There Might Be Hope, Chapter 9, The Forests of Arabia. Perhaps no country on earth is as zealous for agricultural and soil restoration as the reigning king of Middle Eastern oil, Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia is predicted to be the last oil-producing nation in the world, but current leadership is wisely choosing to focus their attentions on the cultivation of something of a modern-day miracle. They want to transform their vast deserts into lush forests and fertile farmland. It's perhaps difficult to imagine the vast peninsula as anything other than desert, but like the Sahara and Leptis Magna, barren sand dunes and camels, campfires and coffee don't represent the Saudi Arabia of old. To begin with, the first coffee trees didn't arrive on the Arabian Peninsula until about the 15th century AD. Moreover, although it has likely long been an arid country, it seems doubtful that Saudi Arabia was always desert. Fossils of hippos and elephants, much larger than the African elephant, have been found there. Historical evidence shows that while the inhabitants of this area grew rich through cross-continental trades of metals and spices, they could and did hold their own agriculturally. The earliest known inhabitants of Saudi Arabia were likely not a mere congregation of nomadic tribes, but developed landed kingdoms and trading centers. Some even point to the possibility that Job, the greatest man of the East, with his 500 donkeys and 500 head of oxen for plowing, may have been from northern Arabia. The Bible lists 3 of his friends as hailing from city names that were known cities on the Arabian Peninsula. Prior to being conquered by the Syrian Empire, evidence seems to support a semi-arid habitat with grassland valleys where shepherds graze their flocks. Becoming nomadic was likely a survival mechanism the Arabian people wisely learned to graciously embrace and now can recall with pride rather than an initial preference. Like the Sahara, the Arabian desert appears to be more desertified than natural desert. Recent excavations have even found thousands of what closely resemble massive livestock gathering and herding chutes, called kites. Saudi Arabia is attempting to create a different kind of kite today. Ambitious, motivated, and well-funded, the Saudis are exploring the best means to reclaim the fertility of their soils and possibly even cool their climate. Following China's lead, they want to plant walls of trees that will capture water, rebuild the soil, stop the sandstorms, potentially restructure weather patterns, and reclaim the desert. It's called the 1 Trillion Project, and the goal is to plant 1 trillion trees before 2030. The hope is to reclaim desertified land with forest. It sounds idyllic. It sounds Eden-like. It's not working. As anyone who has ever planted a tree knows, simply planting a tree doesn't guarantee its growth. Trees need care. Trees need water. Trees need a healthy soil microbiome. When it comes to healing their soils, though, Saudi Arabia likely has some considerable advantages in its pursuit that most other countries don't have. Namely, they aren't battling soils saturated with sides and transgenes to the degree that other countries are. As the top livestock producer in the Middle East, they also have dairy cattle, sheep, horses, and goats. Thus, they had the advantage of manure. Previous generations had 2 options when it came to utilizing manure as a fertilizer. It could be applied fresh. While fresh manure is nutrient-rich, it's also rich in bacteria that is harmful to the soil, and there's a possibility that the harmful bacteria will outcompete beneficial bacteria for survival. Fresh manure is also incredibly expensive to ship due to its high water content. The second option would be to cure or age the manure for a time. This allows the harmful bacteria to die off. However, as the manure ages, it loses much of its nutritional value through evaporation or leaching. Manures are also often laden with sides and antibiotics that kill off elements of the healthy soil microbiome that we want to reestablish to rebuild our soils. Dried or cured manures are easier to ship, but often not worth shipping. Over the past decades, our technology in fertilizer production has improved tremendously, though. We now have methods to simultaneously remove water content in manure, kill off any harmful bacteria, and stabilize its nutrients in a timely way. And why wouldn't we want to do so? So many environmental advocates are pushing for the elimination of the livestock industry to solve their manure problem. But how often have we heard a move to eliminate synthetic and organic nitrogen fertilizers? One industry is comprised of a multitude of small business owners, and the other of powerful corporations. If we could replace synthetic and organic nitrogen fertilizers with manure-based biotic fertilizers, how different would the Earth look? Oceanic dead zones would substantially decrease, our foods would become more nutrient dense, our people would be healthier, happier, and stronger. Dense, fertile, nutrient-rich soil microbiomes could be rebuilt. We could at least begin to stabilize our soil loss and potentially rebuild the billions of tons of farm soils we've lost. Known as biotic fertilizers, this new class of fertilizers approaches the soil differently. Biotic fertilizers aren't meant to directly feed plants, nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. They're designed to feed the soil microbiome so that it can, in coordination with plants, create complex healing fatty acids, proteins, carbohydrates, and amino acids to feed animals and people. They are designed to help support the soil microbiome in breaking down soil minerals that would otherwise be undigestible to plants and feed those minerals to the plants. They function more like the slower, natural nutrient recycling and creation process that occurs in uncultivated soils. However, they are customized to meet the needs of the soil microbiome they will be applied to. When we focus on feeding the soil microbiome, we understand that a healthy soil microbiome produces its own plant-available organic nitrogen in the form plants prefer, proteins and amino acids. Biotic fertilizers operate on the belief that feeding each soil microbiome what it needs will provide soil microlife with the strength and sustenance to grow nutrient-dense foods. We are no longer focused on growing crops. We must focus on growing soils. They will grow the crops for us. Biotic fertilizers also aren't a means of offloading some excess byproduct from another industry. They are reestablishing, maximizing, and enhancing the natural plant-animal loop that has existed since the dawn of time. Biotic fertilizers are not merely fixing a broken animal-soil-plant pathway or returning to the good old days of agriculture. Biotic fertilizers and a biotic approach utilize all that has been learned and studied from generations of agriculturists, soil scientists, and a vast network of researchers to make a huge leap forward in agricultural understanding and ability far past what any previous generation of agriculturists accomplished. It can only be done because of the faith and perseverance of these pioneers in agriculture who went before us. A dead or dying soil microbiome is like a hospital patient on the brink of death, but with a strong will to live. It needs a great deal of care and tenderness. It also needs the right diagnostics. When the multitude of mystery illnesses began emerging in the 2000s, people turned to the same classical medical institutions they had always relied upon, only to learn that available medical tests were insufficient to diagnose their conditions. Out of this tremendous need, a new branch of medicine emerged, known as functional medicine. In functional medicine, medical conditions were not treated as isolated problems of individual organs, but as connected events across an intimately interconnected body. Functional medicine physicians forwent peddling prescription medication band-aids and surgeries to eliminate individual symptoms and sought to heal the root causes of these illnesses. Along with the emergence of functional medicine as a discipline, emerged fantastic new diagnostic laboratories with abilities far beyond basic blood chemistry levels. Just as soil scientists were beginning to view the soil as a biological civilization rather than a mineral medium, these diagnostic labs and functional physicians were beginning to assess bacterial civilizations and fungal empires. A conventional medicine blood test might measure the amount of B12 present in a patient's bloodstream. A functional medicine blood test would measure the blood cells' response and ability to utilize B12. The conventional medicine patient might be told that their B12 levels were fine and that their fatigue and anxiety were simply from stress. The functional medicine patient might learn that their cellular DNA was struggling to process B12 and that their fatigue and anxiety could be improved simply by taking a different form of B12. Other functional medicine diagnostics could separate out different strains and percentages of bacteria within the digestive tract, or measure the integrity of the cell membranes of the digestive tract itself. The entire shift was twofold. Firstly, functional medicine viewed the body as more than merely a host of chemical reactions. Functional medicine took a biological view of the body that sought to understand fungal colonies, chronic viruses, and bacterial biofilms. Functional medicine acknowledged that the body's biological responses were often considerably more intricate than had previously been believed. The second shift was to reassess our definition of health. In conventional medicine, an absence of pain, malady, or injury has long been viewed as healthy. But in functional medicine, health is the presence of strength, energy, and vitality. It's maximizing a person's biological potential. The absence of symptoms or the inability to locate a cause is not the opposite of sickness. The opposite of illness is thriving. For decades, we've held a similar chemical approach to our soil microbiome, fields, and crops. As in conventional medicine, chemical and mineral testing have been the gold standard for soil testing. Like basic blood work, it's not unhelpful information, but these standards were set back when we believed that the soil was a purely mineral medium. Today we know better. We need a similar shift in our approach to the soil. Like the human body, perhaps the first stop for our soils should be improved diagnostics that reveal to us the health of its microbial communities, as well as its chemical status. Before we can create a healing plan, we need to triage the damage. Labs already exist that can easily and affordably test soils, not merely for chemical elements, but for the cumulative health of the soil microbiome, as well as for its various communities. Growers can send in soil samples to measure mycorrhizae, nematodes, active bacteria, active fungi, total fungi, and protozoa. Understanding the overall balance of the soil microbiome within a field, or lack of balance, will empower the grower to feed specific microbial communities with fertilizers targeted for that community, or provide starter bacteria or spores to restore the soil microbiome. We must not forget that 700 different types of bacteria are needed simply to germinate a seed. Because of this, and because soil microbial communities naturally change and shift in collaboration with the plant throughout the life cycle of the plant, it seems logical that we ought to check and test the soil microbiome multiple times during the growing season and the following season as well. These tests are inexpensive and the payoffs are enormous. Another essential tool is testing for both the presence and the quantity of pesticides within the soil. Depending upon the types and the amounts of pesticides applied and persisting, these pesticides can destroy some soil communities and shift others, such as bacterial communities, away from beneficial bacteria towards the dominance of harmful bacteria. Pesticide testing is considerably more expensive, and due to the immense quantity of pesticide formulas, has room for improvement in its accuracy. The third component of our diagnostics needs to be measuring the plant Brix levels. Brix levels are a simple, inexpensive, and easy measurement of plant health, which directly corresponds not only to vegetable or fruit flavor and nutrient density, but also to how attractive or unattractive the plant is to harmful insects. If the soil microbiome is thriving and balanced, and pesticide levels are low to non existent, then Brix levels should be high. When soil microbiomes are healthy and thriving, plants can maximize their nutrient density. When nutrient density is maximized, fruits and vegetables become sweeter and more flavorful, and insects lose their interest in devouring them. Healthy and thriving soils are erosion resistant soils. They are also able to capture and hold water. A healthy soil microbiome is the difference between productive semi-arid to arid farmland and barren sand dunes that follow the winds on their whimsies. What about the sand dunes of Arabia? Can soil microbiomes like these be remediated sufficiently to support the forests? This remains to be seen. In nature, forests are usually built upon grasslands over time, but healing desertified soil microbiomes to support grasslands or even crops is within reach. A better start to greening the deserts might be saturating strategic areas with microbial teas. Like kombucha for the soil, microbial soil teas are designed for specific soil needs and contain prebiotics and probiotics to help jumpstart the soil to life. We can also introduce fungal spores to initiate mycorrhizal colonies. Bearing in mind that the mycorrhizae is a husband in need of a wife, it's important for fields to be simultaneously seeded with a cover crop. This will allow the mycorrhizae to marry into a plant root system, creating a symbiotic relationship that will result in beginning to restock the soil's carbon pantry with humic and fulvic acids and restore the soil's natural mini water aquifers. The sooner we can begin to build these, the less water we will ultimately need to grow crops and the less erosion we will experience. This has been the age-old problem with worn-out farmlands, such as those surrounding Leptis magna and across the Middle East. Once soils reach a certain level of depletion in the soil microbiome pantry, the microbes that build and maintain the water reservoirs starve to death. Soil infrastructure gets broken down, and the soils no longer absorb rainwater. Rain still falls in the desert, but there's no life in the soil to capture it. Once the soil microbiome has been stabilized with some basic infrastructure, it will be ready for the more solid and substantial food of biotic fertilizers to further build the soil microbiome's carbon infrastructure, water storage capacity, and nutrient storehouses. Admittedly, our present understanding of the soil microbiome, like our understanding of the ocean, is still quite rudimentary. Despite this, such an approach has been demonstrated to transform sand into loam as soil microbes build complex carbon, fatty acids, protein, and water reservoirs, along with soil infrastructure. Loam is by definition a soil with a strong granular structure created by the presence of high organic matter. As the soil microbiome comes back to life, sand will deepen to a soft and then rich brown color. This is no overnight process. The speed and success of soil restoration will depend on how accurately we supply the correct quantity and quality of nutrients a particular soil microbiome needs. It also depends upon appropriate watering, sunlight, and temperature. Some elements are out of our control. Existing pesticide and transgene residues that inhibit soil microbiome growth may be the most challenging elements to address, though. Nevertheless, with enough resources and determination, sand can be turned into healthy, thriving, loamy soil where nutrient-dense food can be grown, and perhaps, with time, even trees. We have no lack of eroded, pulverized, and depleted farmlands and former farmlands in desperate need of soil microbiome restoration. These are increasingly hedged in by cities and surrounded by mountainous, rocky, ice-covered, and otherwise simply unfarmable lands. Time is of the essence. What brought us here is simple. The massive erosion we've witnessed can simply be summed up as a failure to understand soils as biological civilizations rather than as a mineral medium, leading to the death of our farm soils through synthetic inorganic nitrogen, pesticides, and transgenes. The scientific and practical applications of this momentous shift in agriculture are likely the easiest aspects to adopt. Perhaps the most important factor not yet discussed is that the regreening of our farmlands and deserts would require a changing of our hearts and minds. We're going to have to reimagine what an idyllic farm field looks like. We're going to have to say goodbye to broad, insect-free fields with crusty grayish, hard-pan, barren furrows. We probably won't be driving past miles and miles of the same crop. The ideal field for the soil microbiome health will likely be narrower and shorter than we've grown accustomed to in order to provide close access to soil microbial and mycorrhizae nurseries. Farms will grow a variety of crops to ensure the nutrient density of each. Monoculture is as stressful to the soil microbiome as drought. Farmers will find new ways to re-embrace diversified crop agriculture. Rather than an absence of insects, we're going to be looking for a particular balance of insect species favoring the beneficial. We're going to rely on them to be a key part of our soil diagnostics to tell us what's missing in the soil microbiome. Rather than the absence of weeds, we're going to be monitoring which weeds are appearing and what they might be telling us about the health of our soil microbiome. Ultimately, we will need less food and fewer supplements because our foods will become more nutrient dense. Crops will be robust, and although no longer toxic to insects, they will be less desirable to them. Our crops will withstand drought and fungal attacks better. With soil at its peak performance, a grower will likely apply less fertilizer because the soil microbiome is functioning as it was designed to. The fertilizer we do apply will be better absorbed because it is in the form soil civilizations can best utilize. Farmers can focus on only replenishing the nutrients required by their soil microbiome at strategic stages in its development. We will need more young men and women to pursue the study of the soil microbiome and develop new and enhanced diagnostic tools to help us learn more of the vast world of soil science that lies yet undiscovered. Most importantly, we must give farmers freedom and support healthy competition between them, something that hasn't happened since 1933, when FDR first reigned in American agriculture under socialism. In the 1920s, American farmers were really good at producing food. Really good. The United States had such an abundance of relatively healthy food that the cost of food dropped substantially. Imagine that. The United States was world-renowned for its abundance of relatively healthy, inexpensive food. Immigrants arriving to America are reported to often have been shocked by the sheer abundance and affordability of food in America. This relative abundance of food likely originated from America's worldview at the time. America had predominantly been settled by Christians, often fleeing persecution, if not imminent imprisonment and death for their faith. They had a tough road, creating new lives for themselves out of the wilderness. It would be remiss not to mention that contrary to current popular belief, American Christians were the first religious group of all world religions to find slavery morally intolerable. Until that point, every culture on every continent approached slavery within its society as a normal part of life. America's early founders believed that God was inherently good and that he had created man in his image. It was this core common belief that led them to write that all men are created equal, endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. Their approach to American agriculture was shaped in the belief that God had given man both the authority and responsibility to care for the animals and plants of the earth. They also believed that man was born into sin, and that all the wrongs of the world were the result of sin, either our own or someone else's. They believed that both they themselves and anyone who wronged them would ultimately be held accountable by a just and righteous God. They believed that those who did good would ultimately receive eternal reward. Those who didn't would suffer loss. These concepts shaped and motivated them and how they responded to others. These were common American beliefs because generations of Americans learned to read using the same book, the Bible. They also generally believed in tiers of order and governance, including self-governance, family governance, ecclesiastical governance, and civil governance, and that each had distinct roles and responsibilities. Each person had a unique God-given identity and role in life. Because they believed that God rewards each person individually for their hard work and ingenuity, they valued not only hard work and ingenuity, but also personal property, and ensuring that each person received the fruits of their own labor. They held what would be known today as an abundance mindset. Because they believed that God would provide them with what they needed, they generally believed in giving, and giving freely, to those less fortunate than themselves, primarily through the church. Obviously, not everyone held these beliefs in America, and there were pockets of Americans whose views differed considerably. For hundreds of years, though, these general beliefs were held by the majority of Americans. These were the foundational beliefs that inspired hard work and provided a framework for American farmers to create an abundance such that the world had rarely, if ever, seen before. It was these people who generally valued storing up eternal treasures for themselves more than earthly ones that ultimately laid the foundation for one of the wealthiest per capita nations the world has ever seen. In the mid to late 19th century, a number of theorists and philosophers emerged with radically contrasting views to those which had built America. Charles Darwin and Karl Marx were two of these men. Their beliefs were based on man being the central god of his own life and destiny, the captain of his own ship. They believed that there was no God to judge, no God to reward, no God to avenge. There was no eternal paradise or damnation. The only happiness they believed in was what they could create for themselves by whatever means necessary. In the early 1900s, the world had yet to witness the full misery and atrocities of communism in control of a country. Multiple related branches of socialist, communist, and anarchist parties had openly built their platforms and followings in American politics since the late 1800s. In the 1920s, both communist and socialist parties offered presidential candidates, as did the Farmer Labor Party, whose name belied its strong socialist and communist roots and affiliations. Political infighting and divisions hindered most of their progress. Their ultimate goal was complete totalitarian control. Class warfare, land control, and agriculture lay at the heart of their plans. Leaders within these movements often projected the plight of European and Russian laborers on recently immigrated American farmers and laborers who hadn't quite established themselves in their new country yet and were vulnerable to this propaganda. Around the 1930s, as the world was gradually awakening to the real dangers of life and liberty posed by these ideologies, political infighting and internal divisions intensified to the point that the more formal branches of many of these movements, including the Farmer Labor Party, generally dispersed. Somehow the ideas persisted, though, and found their ways into the heart of American agriculture. The plain truth is that the root causes of the agricultural crisis were far removed from agriculture. The Agricultural Crisis, 1920 to 1923, by R.R. Infeld. Regarding the Great Depression, we did it. We're very sorry. We won't do it again. Ben Bernanke, November 8, 2002, in a speech given at a conference to honor Milton Friedman on the occasion of his 90th birthday. Early American revolutionaries were likely the first known government to finance their war by printing paper money. As with all untethered money printing, it didn't take long for the money to be essentially worthless. George Washington is credited with saying that a wagon load of Continentals will hardly purchase a wagon load of provisions. Paper money was meaningless to the local merchants who would only accept precious metal coins. To solve this problem after the war, the new American government took out a loan, bought precious metal coins, and burned their paper money. Similarly, post World War I governments sought to finance their recoveries by printing off paper money, and the natural consequence of this was extreme inflation in the post World War I 1920s. The Federal Reserve, which had only been in existence for a scant 7 years at this time, began to raise interest rates to slow inflation. People suddenly couldn't pay their loans. Then banks began to fail. Beginning in the early 1920s, agricultural commodity prices took a drastic fall, with some dropping by more than 50%. The dairy industry bounced back first, being locally produced and not shipped overseas, but grain crop prices, particularly corn, continued to fall. Following the war, European countries had rapidly printed off money to meet the government's needs and left their citizens with paper practically worth nothing. So falling prices were initially blamed on global grain markets rapidly contracting. But then and now, deflation and speculative manipulation brought on by the Federal Reserve has been considered to be the root of falling agricultural prices. In response, some farmers began to voluntarily fallow fields. Given that the majority of farmers at that time were small, self-sustaining family farms, it's a shame that the excess grain produced in the 1920s could not simply have been stored away for a rainy day or a decade-long drought. Then a 1930s severe drought hit. The Midwest and Great Plains were affected first. In 1931, the black blizzards came. These great walls of parched soils began rolling across the plains and even into the eastern seaboard, smothering New York City and Washington, D.C. By 1932, farmers were making less than one-third the income they had made in 1929. Many were forced to foreclose, worsening the crisis. In March of 1933, Franklin Delano Roosevelt was sworn into office, and in May of 1933, the Agricultural Adjustment Act was passed. It was the end of freedom for American farmers. The 9 most terrifying words in the English language are, "I am from the government, and I'm here to help." Ronald Reagan. Farmers went from being independent entrepreneurs to being welfare recipients, simply by virtue of their vocation, whether they liked it or not. The initial stated goal of the Agricultural Adjustment Act was parity for agricultural prices, that everyone would get paid the same amount for the same commodity. Soon the goal became parity of income, that all farmers would earn purchasing power equal to the income of a non-farm worker between the years of 1909 and 1914. These were considered to be the last good years. The first step to parity was for the government to step in and set prices on agricultural commodities. No longer would the supply and demand be allowed to balance themselves, or farmers be able to earn more for producing a superior product. The second step was to control production. Farmers were paid not to farm. They were paid to leave their fields unplanted, or worse, were forced to plow their crops under. If a farmer didn't want to participate in this, it was fine. But in addition to receiving government payments, participating farmers were essentially allowed to sell their remaining produce tax-free. Non-participating farmers had to pay taxes on their crop sales. The result was that an estimated 10.4 million acres of cotton were plowed under in 1933. Across America, fields were left barren. In 1932, there were 14 dust storms of regional extent. In 1933, 38. In 1934, 22. In 1935, 40. In 1936, 68. in 1937, 72, in 1938, 61, in 1939, 30. In Amarillo, the worst year for storms was 1935, when they lasted a total of 908 hours. 7 times from January to March, the visibility in Amarillo declined to 0. One of these complete blackouts lasted 11 hours. In another instance, a single storm raged for 3.5 days. Overzealous tractor usage and plowing of the 1920s were likely initial contributors to the Dust Bowl of the 1930s, but leaving fields unplanted and without a cover crop to protect and support the mycorrhizae and the soil microbiome was a death sentence. Poverty included not only grains such as wheat and corn, but also encompassed livestock. Beginning in the fall of 1933, the government bought and killed 6 million hogs, including pregnant sows. Of the 6 million, an estimated 1 million were processed for meat and donated to the Red Cross. At the same time, when many Americans were homeless and hungry, if not starving, the remaining 5 million hogs were simply destroyed or tanked and rendered inedible. For farmers who still had a herd left after the buyout, hog prices increased a mere 20 to 30%. Cattle weren't off the table either. In Nebraska, nearly 500,000 head of cattle were shot and buried in pits to earn agricultural adjustment money. The outcry against the Agricultural Adjustment Act of 1933 was substantial, and not because it awarded the Secretary of Agriculture $100 million, today's equivalent of over $2 billion, for administrative expenses. In 1936, the act was struck down by the Supreme Court as unconstitutional because it essentially coerced federal redistribution of wealth. The act took money from agricultural processors to give it to agricultural producers. A tax in the general understanding of the term, and as used in the Constitution, signifies an exaction for the support of the government. The word has never been thought to connote the expropriation of money from one group for the benefit of another. The act invades the reserved rights of the states. It is a statutory plan to regulate and control agricultural production, a matter beyond the powers delegated to the federal government. The tax, the appropriation of the funds raised, and the direction for their disbursement are but parts of the plan. They are but means to an unconstitutional end. If the cotton grower elects not to accept the benefits, he will receive less for his crops. Those who receive payments will be able to undersell him. The result may well be financial ruin. The coercive purpose and intent of the statute is not obscured by the fact that it has not been perfectly successful. It is pointed out that, because there still remained a minority whom the rental and benefit payments were insufficient to induce to surrender their independence of action, the Congress has gone further, and in the Bankhead Cotton Act, used the taxing power in a more directly minatory fashion to compel submission. This progression only serves more fully to expose the coercive purpose of the so-called tax imposed by the present act. It is clear that the Department of Agriculture has properly described the plan as one to keep a non-cooperating minority in line. This is coercion by economic pressure. The asserted power of choice is illusory. A possible result of sustaining the claimed federal power would be that every business group which thought itself underprivileged might demand that a tax be laid on its vendors or vendees, the proceeds to be appropriated to the redress of its deficiency of income. The supposed cases are no more improbable than would the present act have been deemed a few years ago. Until recently, no suggestion of the existence of any such power in the federal government has been advanced. The expressions of the framers of the Constitution, the decisions of this court interpreting that instrument, and the writings of great commentators will be searched in vain for any suggestion that there exists in the clause under discussion or elsewhere in the Constitution the authority whereby every provision and every fair implication from that instrument may be subverted, the independence of the individual states obliterated, and the United States converted into a central government exercising uncontrolled police power in every state of the Union, superseding all local control and regulation of the affairs or concerns of the states. Hamilton himself, the leading advocate of broad interpretation of the power to tax and appropriate for the general welfare, never suggested that any power granted by the Constitution could be used for the destruction of local self-governments in the states. United States versus Butler et al. Despite the 1933's Agricultural Adjustment Act being overturned, the federal government's foot was in the door when it came to agricultural control, and the redistribution didn't stop. It merely took a less direct route. Price control or support programs, crop insurance, and subsidies, under a multitude of names, have come and gone since then. Today, under our modern Farm Bill, the USDA offers more than 60 direct and indirect aid programs for farmers and pays a select group of farmers around $20 to $30 billion a year to ensure farmers receive a minimum price for the crops they plant. Some of the aid, such as crop insurance, is virtually impossible to track, leading to cries of cronyism. Most of the aid goes to large farms growing the staple crops of corn, soy, and wheat. Upwards of 90% of these crops are genetically modified, excluding wheat, which may be soon. The majority of them are also intensively synthetically fertilized and drenched with a multitude of pesticides. Why is the U.S. government subsidizing the poisoning of our people, our soils, our water, and our skies? If genetic modification and its wonder sides are so phenomenal at increasing crop yields, shouldn't they pay for themselves? Do they really need for the American people to slip them some monopoly money under the table, or are they ready to stand on their own 2 feet? If farming practices produce a nutritionally inferior product, destroy our soils, and are financially unsustainable on their own, on what merits do they deserve to be supported? It is the farm subsidies that the USDA hands out that drives what farmers grow and what Americans eat. The bulk of subsidies are awarded to grow staple grains such as corn, wheat, and soy. Fruits, vegetables, and organics receive relatively little. The problem isn't in the distribution of the subsidies, though. The problem is that the government has made themselves to be the self-appointed middleman. Government bureaucracies simply aren't particularly agile, responsive, or unbiased in representing either consumers' or farmer needs and interests. Nor do subsidies ensure food security and a reliable supply of food staples. On the contrary, they actually promote waste and not responsibility. Unlike other American enterprises, farmers receive government payments regardless of whether their crops fail or thrive, and because of the redundancy of programs, farmers can even be, and often are, paid twice for the same lost crop. Moreover, because agricultural subsidies are neither equally nor equitably distributed amongst American farmers, the ripple effect across American agriculture actually harms non-subsidized farmers, who may be either dependent upon these staple crops to feed their livestock, or growing the same crops without subsidies. In this sense, non-subsidized farmers are having their own wealth redistributed to their neighbors. On the one hand, Americans are told that farmers must use poisonous chemicals to feed our world population. If we don't use genetically modified crops and rainbow pesticides, people will starve. On the other hand, American farmers are told that low food prices are their own faults because they're simply producing too much food. Hence, they must accept subsidies if they are to stay afloat financially. Which is it? The American taxpayer is paying farmers to produce food that consumers themselves may not eat, farmed using principles and technology consumers themselves may not support. The real question may be, who are agricultural subsidies benefiting? Since farm subsidies began in 1933, we've lost 70% of our farms, many due to bankruptcy. If subsidies were supposed to ensure farmers with livable prices for their products, and ensure a steady supply of food to the market, they clearly aren't doing their job. They are merely eliminating a certain kind of farmer, the smaller ones. Under the farm welfare state, American farms are growing in size but shrinking in number as they are increasingly consolidated under increasing corporate and conglomerate control. Have the lure of subsidies and a zero risk business plan become fundamental in this transition? Is having fewer farms under more consolidated control really in the best interest of our national food security? Could it be that factions within the American government simply prefer the control a consolidated food chain offers them in keeping with Marxist principles? In the mid 1980s, at the behest of its farmers, New Zealand repealed its subsidies. The next few years marked a challenging transition period for New Zealand farmers as their entrepreneurial mettle and adaptability were tested. They came through like gold. Only 1% of farmers left farming during the transition. Today, their agriculture thrives on freedom. Ours can too. No one takes better care of their soil and their livestock than a farmer whose home and family are dependent upon them and hopes to pass them on to the next generation. Period. Our best hope for healing our soils, our land, our water, and our people is to unleash the American farmer again. Our lives and those of future generations depend upon young, brilliant, energetic, entrepreneurial farmers who will roll up their sleeves, educate themselves about the soil microbiome, and invest in their own farmlands. We just need the government to let them alone to do so. Easier said than done. Thank you so much for listening. That is the end of Chapter 9. I hope you'll subscribe to this channel, like this video, and if you'd like more background information about some of the research that I did, I will be sharing that over on patreon.com. You can head on over there and learn more about the things I found and some of the interesting things I learned while I was preparing this chapter. Thank you so much. Bye.